difficulty. T, time to call 911. The sooner they get to the hospital, the sooner they'll get treatment. And that can make a remarkable difference in the recovery of
your neighbor, the waiter, grandmother, grandfather.
So learn FAST, the sudden signs of a stroke, then pass it on, because you never know who might save you.
Your wife, your colleague.
Spot a stroke fast. Visit strokeassociation.org. Brought to you by the American Stroke Association and the Ad Council.
Behind Enemy Lines. Back on the air.
Gene Bardelli, back behind enemy lines. Joining me on the line right now, it's a pleasure to welcome to the show a man who admittedly will know so much more about the situation in Iran than what I fumbled through last week on the show in trying to speak about it intelligently. I'm speaking to a new friend. He is not only a media commentator, an author, a congressional liaison and public spokesperson for the United States Representative Office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, Alireza Jafarzadeh. Sir, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Gene. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, listen, we have to talk about some real heavy topics right now. Now, just as a way of background, you and your organization were the first to uncover the then unknown nuclear sites in Iran, correct?
Absolutely correct, Gene. It was August 14, 2002, some 15 years ago, that we had a press conference in Washington and we revealed the existence of two nuclear sites in Natanz and Arak that would eventually, that was in the process of developing, and they would give two different pathways to the fissile material for a bomb for the Iran regime. That revelation on that day changed the whole dynamics about the attention of the world on the nuclear program of Iran, because on the same evening, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the UN nuclear watchdog, requested a visit to these sites, and eventually, a few months later, they managed to get their first visit to the nuclear sites of Iran, and that's where they found centrifuge machines in Natanz and a pretty advanced development of a heavy water facility in Arak, and all of the things started afterwards. And we have continued ever since with the revelation of other nuclear sites of Iran, or projects, or top nuclear scientists, or the front companies that they use to cover their operations and the program. We also delved into the core of the nuclear program of Iran, which is of a military nature. The nuclear program is not built around giving them nuclear energy. Rather, it's built around giving them nuclear weapons. And everything else is pretty much like a facade around it. So we give a lot of details since then until now. Some about 100 different nuclear revelations about the various sites and personnel or experts of the nuclear program of Iran so far.
Right, and you have worked through and being this watchdog, and really, in reading up on you, sir, the amount of revelations from the nuclear site that's been near Iran that was building the centrifuge parts, Taba, I believe it was, and that was back in 2011. There was another site in 2010 in Jafarzadeh, I believe, that you were instrumental in discussing and bringing to light as well. You've worked with multiple administrations in finding these things. Can you give us a little perspective on what it's like from working with, the Bush administration back in 2002 and I guess interacting with that administration, and then interacting with the Obama administration, and now coming full circle to President Trump? Has you seen a real inconsistency in American policy towards Iran?
Well, Gene, honestly speaking, we have had a tough time in pursuing policy in Washington over the years, and it even dates back before the Bush administration. And that the general consensus in Washington over the past 3 decades has been that, well, there is a regime that is a bad regime, repressive regime, and so they were looking for moderates within the regime, trying to find a faction within the regime that could be easier to work with and to reach out with. And they entirely rejected the notion that the people of Iran, the majority of which are, actually very young, are opposed to this regime. And they refrain from, cooperating, working, or even looking at anything outside of the regime. And that led to a lot of problems for the United States, for the whole region, that actually helped the regime to, continue their policies. And we had to do an uphill battle in different administrations. However, on the nuclear thing, because this is something that the whole world is really concerned about, we had much more success in this regard in getting people's attention in various administrations, although most of the time they were very reluctant to seeing this information, especially if you are in the middle of a negotiation with the Iranian regime, trying to cut a deal with them on their nuclear program. Suddenly we come up with another information showing that Iran is cheating. Iran is actually secretly developed another organization controlled by the Revolutionary Guards and the military that is tasked with the weaponization of the nuclear program. And, that went counter to all the dialogue and negotiations that we're doing. So we weren't always welcomed with the information that we put out. But I think overall, I think the world appreciates, especially senior members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, who always said that if it weren't really for our revelations of the nuclear program of Iran, the Iran regime most probably would have had the bomb by now.
Absolutely. And I see that just from, like I said, reviewing the information that I've found online about how instrumental you and the National Council of Resistance of Iran has been. But now we have the information thanks to you. And what we do with the information, as a nation and as part of the international community, don't necessarily coincide. How do you feel about initially when this deal was made with Iran that President Obama seemingly, jammed down everyone's throat here in America? How do you feel about that deal?
Well, the nuclear agreement between the 5+1, as they call it, the
right.
5 members of the Security Council in Germany and the Iranian regime that was worked out eventually in mid-2015, put some restrictions on the overt part of the nuclear program of Iran in terms of limiting the number of centrifuges or how much uranium hexafluoride they can produce, that kind of things. But the major problem with that is that first, that nuclear agreement legitimized the enrichment, uranium enrichment of the Iran regime, which is absolutely not necessary at all. It should have been entirely rejected. Second, it maintained the entire nuclear infrastructure of the Iranian regime, though limiting it in some aspects, which is a big problem. You don't want to allow the Iran regime to have that kind of a nuclear operations and structures for whatever purposes, because there's no other purpose but building the bomb as far as the Iran regime is concerned. And third, it allowed the enhancement of the program by allowing them certain, research and development activities, which in the long run actually helps the regime with more advanced centrifuge machines. And fourth, and most importantly, is the inspection regime, the access to the nuclear sites that are actually very limited, and the main nuclear sites of Iran that are focused on the weaponization part of the program, on building the actual nuclear warhead and developing it, are actually primarily in military sites, and those have practically been off limits. The International Atomic Energy Agency does not have currently access to those sites. A couple of weeks ago, they released a new book called Iran's Nuclear Core, that details 6 different nuclear sites in Iran with all the maps, the locations, the personnel, and showing that these sites are engaged in nuclear weaponization but have been off limits. The IAEA hasn't gone to those places. So how can you give a clean bill of health to the nuclear program of Iran if you can't even inspect the main suspect sites that are engaged in those things? So these are major problems with the nuclear agreement. And, whether they want to fix those problems or come up with something new, I think it's something that the Congress is going to look at. They have 60 days to look at it. But I think in the meantime, we need to look at the Iran regime and Iran as a whole. The threat from Iran, the Iran regime, is not just their nuclear weapons program. They have a very advanced missile program, which is a necessary part of their nuclear program. They need the delivery system. Then they are the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism in the region and elsewhere. They're exporting their Islamic extremism to the countries in the region. Look how heavily they're involved in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, you name it. And then the Iran regime is a major violator of human rights. They're the number one per capita executioner in the world. And the situation has even worsened under the regime's president, who just started his second term, Hassan Rouhani. And the other aspect that is extremely important for the outside world to know, especially for this administration, the new administration, as they're crafting the new policies, that there is a very genuine, potent and capable organized opposition to the Iranian regime that relies on the vast majority of the population who are opposed to this regime. This regime represents no more than 4% of the population. This is according to one of the top 3 presidential election candidates of the regime itself, one of the top, generals, who said that we are a government of 4%. And this organized opposition that has done great things for the people in Iran and outside Iran, they're heavily involved in organizing anti-government demonstrations in Iran. Most of the political prisoners in Iran now, as we speak, belong to this movement. And they have had like 120,000 members and supporters of the movement executed by the Iran regime for political charges. And they have a parliament in exile. They have a 10-point plan, a platform for the future of Iran that is based on the vote of the population, freedom of speech, freedom of political parties, gender equality, religious tolerance, peace in the Middle East, and a non-nuclear Iran. And it's led by a woman, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. This is extremely important because the core of Islamic fundamentalism is based on misogyny. And then you have on the other side, you have women leading this movement that just really hits the heart of Islamic fundamentalism. And so the solution is really there. It has very large bipartisan support among the members of Congress, both on the House and the Senate. And we are hoping that the new policy, as it's been announced by President Trump, will be implemented based on what the announcement was. The good thing about this policy is that President Trump spoke about the Iranian people who are the main victims of this regime, as he described it. He said the people of Iran want change, and which is, a welcome recognition by a president of the United States. That's true. And that obviously the change has to come from within. There's no need to send arms or boots on the ground or anything like that. We just need political understanding. And the other element of that policy was that the president announced the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. That's very important because if that's implemented, that would really cause huge problem for the Iranian regime and dry up a lot of their resources and, their ability to operate in the region, but also their ability to suppress their own populations. That terrorist designation needs to be fully implemented by the Treasury Department. All of the entities, organizations that are associated with the Revolutionary Guards need to be also included as part of that designation. Much of the Iranian economy is actually controlled by the Revolutionary Guards. They all need to come under, the full implementation of this. So if that policy, new policy announced by the president, is fully implemented, then that could actually help paving the way for change in Iran by the Iranian people.
You know, you bring up a great point.